Life is Strange Reunion, from what we know so far, feels less like just another game and more like an emotional reckoning between Deck 9, Max, Chloe, and the community itself, which has carried this weight since the first ending in Arcadia Bay. The fact that it is being explicitly marketed as the conclusion of Max and Chloe's saga already places the development in a farewell atmosphere, but sounds quite different from Double Exposure, which still had one foot in let's expand this universe, rather than let's close this chapter. One thing that catches my attention is how the concept seems to have been born directly from where Double Exposure left off, both in structure, university setting, thriller vibes, a 3-day mystery, and the focus on Max, but now with the courage to bring Chloe back to the center of the narrative. This gives me the feeling that Reunion is, internally, a repair project, almost as if the studio is saying, okay, let's face the emotional consequences of that sacrifice and those timelines, instead of just continuing to open new possibilities. From a development standpoint, you can feel the enormous pressure. It's a game built by and for fans of the original, but developed by a studio that inherited the franchise and is coming off a difficult phase of layoffs and internal changes. To me, this leaves the project with a vibe of a rebuilding team trying to win the title in the season where everyone is watching, especially since the marketing is hitting hard on the definitive end of their story, which increases the weight on the narrative team. I like how the mechanical and emotional contexts align. Max is a professor at Caledon, an inevitable fire in 3 days, and Chloe's return with impossible memories. All of this speaks deeply to the ideas of trauma, guilt, and memory that have always been in the series' DNA. The detail that the rewind is now more flexible and integrated into the loop of exploration, investigation, and deliberate error reinforces that the team wants to turn this power into something more systemic, almost as if the gameplay itself is enacting Max's ruminating on past decisions. At the same time, I sense a certain creative risk. When you sell the game as a reunion 11 years later and the last chance to change their destiny, it's easy to fall into fan service or a script so worried about pleasing people that it forgets to be honest with the characters. The fact that Chloe comes with echoes of backtalk and her Before the Storm persona, while Max continues to evolve her rewind power and a more introspective stance, could become an interesting contrast, or a caricature if the writing isn't careful enough. Another thing that weighs heavily on the development context is the timing. Announcing in January, showing solid gameplay in March, and releasing at the end of March puts Reunion on a very tight marketing cycle, more of a sure shot than prolonged hype. This usually indicates a project that was already well underway before the announcement, likely intended as a direct sequel to Double Exposure. But it also raises the question of whether there was enough time to polish all the narrative ramifications a Life is Strange of this scale requires. In the end, the feeling I get looking at everything shown is of a game carrying a rare weight of expectation. It needs to function as a sequel to Double Exposure, as a spiritual epilogue to the first Life is Strange, and as the final word on Max and Chloe. If Deck 9 can balance this trio, maintaining the focus on difficult choices, the freer use of the rewind, and the honest dynamics between the two, Reunion has a chance to be exactly what the name promises. Not just the characters' reunion, but a reconciliation between what the series was, what it became, and what fans have been waiting to see for over a decade. What has been officially revealed about the story of Life is Strange Reunion is enough to make me feel a very specific mix of hope and nervousness, the kind only this series can provoke. The premise of Chloe arriving at Caledon University carrying impossible memories, fragments of a timeline where she survived and another where she was sacrificed, is probably the most honest starting point this encounter could have, because she doesn't arrive whole. She arrives broken, haunted, and that feels much truer to me than a Chloe who is simply back as if nothing happened. What intrigues me narratively is that for the first time, Max and Chloe are playable co-protagonists, each with their own perspective on the situation. This carries massive weight throughout the entire first game. Chloe was a mirror for Max's conscience, someone who pushed her and revealed who she was. Making her an active protagonist completely changes the dynamic. Now Chloe has real agency, and this will force the narrative to treat her as a complex person rather than just a moral weight on Max's shoulders. The structure of the 3 days leading up to the fire reminds me a lot of that sense of urgency from Arcadia Bay, with the inevitable end approaching while you try to understand what came before. But what makes it different here is that Max knows about the fire from the start. She returned to that past with privileged information, yet she still can't solve everything alone. This sends a narrative message that knowledge of the future isn't enough power when the wounds of the past are still open. There is, however, a legitimate critique that cannot be ignored. The premise of Reunion goes, in a way, against the central message of the first game. The original Life is Strange ended with Max learning that not everything can be reversed, that some losses are permanent, and that trying to control everything comes at a huge cost. Bringing Chloe back, even through careful narrative paths, carries the risk of weakening that lesson. I personally think the game will only stand on its own if it faces this contradiction head-on, instead of ignoring it. And based on what the developers have said, they seem aware of this. The detail of choices from the first game and double exposure still echoing in Reunion's ramifications is, for me, the element that could either elevate or destroy the story. The promise that the reunion between Max and Chloe will behave completely differently depending on who you saved in Arcadia Bay is ambitious. If this branching is superficial, it becomes a marketing trick. But if it is deep enough to make those two versions of the scene sound like emotionally distinct stories, that would be something rare in narrative games. The idea of Chloe using backtalk as a narrative skill tells me something about how the writers are thinking about this character. She doesn't manipulate time like Max. She manipulates people, conversations, and social situations. This perfectly reflects who Chloe has always been, a girl who survived not with supernatural powers, but with attitude, stubbornness, and a brutal ability to push boundaries until a path opened. Mechanically, this seems simple, but narratively, it is a very clever characterization choice. What makes me want to believe in this story most is how the studio described their reunion as having no easy solution and not erasing what was lost. Chloe isn't a prize Max won back, and Max isn't a redeemed hero just for having a second chance. This tension, if the script by Jonathan Zimmerman and Iris Doman can sustain it throughout the narrative, could make Reunion not just the end of a saga, but one of the most mature scripts the series has ever produced. The return of the rewind as a central mechanic already tells me a lot about the design direction Deck 9 chose for Reunion, and honestly, I think it was the right choice. In Double Exposure, the dimension-shifting abilities were conceptually interesting, but they always felt like a power that belonged to another character, not Max. The rewind is intimate, it's anxious. It is the exact mechanical translation of someone who cannot accept consequences. Bringing it back isn't nostalgia for nostalgia's sake, it's character consistency transformed into gameplay. What draws my attention most regarding mechanical changes is that the rewind is now described as free and fluid. You can use it at any time, not just at fixed points determined by the game. This sounds simple, but it changes everything. In the original, there was that tension of when should I use this power, holding on to the rewind as if it were a scarce resource. Here, by freeing up its use, the game seems to bet that the tension comes from elsewhere, not from when to use it, but from realizing that even if you can undo anything, you don't always know what you should have done differently. The gameplay loop shown in the footage, exploring, failing, gathering information, rewinding more prepared, seems like a direct evolution of what the first game proposed, but now with more systemic structure. Before, the rewind was very linear. You reverse time to change an answer or save a moment. In Reunion, it seems the game wants you to use information gathered in a conversation and then go back in time to apply that knowledge in another context, almost like a four-dimensional puzzle. This has real potential to make every area feel like a problem to solve, not just a dialogue corridor. Now, Chloe's backtalk, I have mixed feelings. As an isolated mechanic, it is simpler and less impactful than the rewind. You pay attention to what NPC said, identify argumentative weaknesses, and use that to win a confrontation. It's interesting, but in the previews, those who tested it let slip that it isn't as engaging as rewinding time. What I would hope, however, is that the game uses backtalk not as a substitute for depth, but as a deliberate contrast. Chloe solves problems with social pressure, while Max solves them with time, and that difference should say something about how the two face the world. One design detail I genuinely found clever was the shared choices mechanic when Max and Chloe are in the same scene. Instead of controlling only one, the game alternates between the two with a visual icon that makes it clear which character that decision belongs to. This creates something I rarely see in narrative games, the feeling that you are mediating a relationship in real time, not just picking a side. You aren't Max making decisions that affect Chloe, you are both of them at the same time, trying to get somewhere together. What leaves me a bit skeptical, though, is the rhythm. In the previews, some journalists mentioned that dialogues cannot be skipped and that the pacing is deliberately slow, in the usual Life is Strange style. This works when the game has total confidence in the quality of every scene, but it can drag if any segment is weaker in terms of writing. The free rewind helps because you can re-experience conversations without penalty, but if the text doesn't hold the player's attention during these calmer exploration sections, the mechanical fluidity won't save the pacing. Overall, Reunion's gameplay feels like the most honest the series has ever been in terms of design intent. Every mechanic is clearly at the service of the story and the characters, not the other way around. The rewind is emotional, backtalk is identity, and the shared choices system is relationship turned button. If the execution maintains this alignment until the end, Reunion could be that rare type of game where you leave thinking, not what a cool mechanic, but why did this make me feel so much? What immediately catches my eye when looking at the released images and gameplay is that Deck 9 didn't try to reinvent the visual style. The art direction follows the path of double exposure, but with an extra layer of refinement and detail. And honestly, in my opinion, this is both a plus and a choice that still divides longtime fans. The game runs on Unreal Engine with a revamped look, and this shows mostly in the character models, which have a quality of facial expression much closer to cinema than any other game in the series. But here is my personal point of conflict. This realism, which is technically an advancement, creates a visual distance that the first Life is Strange never had. That original game was built with an almost impressionistic aesthetic, with hand-painted textures and stylized lighting that turned every scene into a painting. You felt like you were inside a memory, not inside a high-fidelity renderer. It's ironic that the more realistic the series' visuals become, the more it loses that dreamlike quality that made the emotional scenes feel unlike anything else. IGN touched exactly on this by saying that the visual watercolors of the original game were swapped for the smooth and realistic in the most recent entries. It's a fair critique. Deck 9 has industry-level facial animations, no exaggeration, but when the surrounding environment loses that sense of stylized wonder, these expressions look technically impressive, yet emotionally a bit hollow. On the positive side, what I genuinely like about Reunion's visuals from what has been shown is the color palette of the Caledon environments. You can see in the trailers and gameplay that the studio is using lighting intentionally to create emotional contrast between quiet exploration scenes and moments of rising tension. The student bar, for example, has a warm, enclosed light that gives exactly the feeling of a place full of people, but isolated from the world. This is art direction at the service of narrative, not just technique for technique's sake. The models for Max and Chloe are perhaps the most controversial aspect of the visuals. Part of the community reacted with strangeness to Chloe's design, some thinking she lost the visual identity she had in Before the Storm and the original, others pointing out that the deliberately androgynous and more mature design makes sense for a character who survived the impossible. I personally would have preferred a middle ground between the original stylization and the current realism, but I understand the creative logic behind the choice. A 29-year-old Chloe, burdened with fragmented memories, shouldn't look like the same 16-year-old girl from Arcadia Bay. One visual element that pleased me a lot was what appears to be the representation of the rewind power in Reunion. From the trailers and gameplay, the rewind time effect uses a cooler, more desaturated palette to mark the temporal transition clearly, while the normal world has warmer tones. It's a functional and elegant art direction decision. You read the game state visually without needing any UI elements, which is always a sign of well-thought-out design. My honest impression is that Life is Strange Reunion is graphically the most technically competent game in the series, but not necessarily the most visually memorable. Deck 9 clearly has a command of the tools. The characters express themselves, the environment breathes, the lighting works emotionally. What's missing, at least in what has been released, is that element of visual identity that made the original unmistakable in a screenshot. If you showed a scene from Reunion to someone without context, they might confuse it with any other high-quality modern narrative game. And that, for a series that always had such a distinct visual voice, still leaves me a bit uneasy. The first thing I want to make clear about performance is that, unlike what sometimes happens with games in this genre, Deck 9 at least made the decision to launch the full game at once. No episodes, no fragmented early access. This, in itself, speaks to a certain maturity in the delivery process. But when you start analyzing the technical details released, the story gets a bit more complicated. On consoles, players will have access to two performance modes, one focused on visual quality and another on frame rate. I have a very clear position on this. For a narrative game like Life is Strange, where you spend most of your time in conversations, exploring environments, and absorbing cinematic scenes, 30 FPS in quality mode shouldn't be a real problem. What I want to know, and what hasn't been detailed by Deck 9 yet, is whether performance mode can maintain a stable 60 FPS, or if it will repeat the problematic pattern Double Exposure had, with drops that left the game jittery exactly during scenes of emotional tension. The recent history of the series on this specific point is not encouraging. Double Exposure arrived with performance issues on console and PC that were documented by the community itself. Crashes, frame rate drops, choices that didn't carry over between chapters. It was exactly the kind of bug you don't expect in a narrative game, which technically shouldn't be stressing the hardware as much as an open world or a shooter. This created real distrust in part of the audience, and Reunion will carry that weight even before release. The minimum PC requirements tell me something interesting about where the game stands technically. To run it at the minimum, you need a GTX 1660 with 6 GB of VRAM and 12 GB of RAM. And the technical notes suggest that even then, you'll be running at 65% resolution scale. This is quite revealing. Deck 9 is using upscaling to compensate for an engine that clearly demands more than the simplified art direction would suggest visually. For comparison, the original Life is Strange ran on practically any machine. This technical evolution isn't necessarily bad, but when a narrative game requires an RTX 3060 and 16 GB of RAM for recommended settings, you start to question if the rendering choices were made with efficiency in mind. What worries me more than the raw number requirements is the mention of a recommended SSD. In linear narrative games, this usually indicates an asset streaming system that loads environments and scenes in real time as you walk, which is positive for visual fluidity, but also one of the most common sources of stuttering and hitches when not well implemented. Deck 9 has shown difficulty optimizing this type of system in Double Exposure, so this point will be a determining factor for the PC experience specifically. On the more optimistic side, PC Gaming Wiki already lists support for 60 FPS and even 120 FPS for PC, plus HDR, which indicates the game was at least developed with modern technical options in mind. This doesn't guarantee a clean execution, but it's different from a game that doesn't even offer those options. If the HDR implementation is well calibrated, it could significantly elevate the visual quality of the indoor and nighttime scenes that already appear in trailers with interesting lighting. Everything released points to a game that will work well on most modern setups, but carries the risk of arriving with irregularities that require patches in the first weeks. Deck 9 has a history of fixing problems after launch, which is something, but for a game that will be Max and Chloe's grand finale, the experience needs to work from the first save, not after the third update. Unstable performance in emotional scenes isn't just a technical inconvenience, it's a break in immersion at the very moment this game needs to get right. The first thing that needs to be said is that at $40 for the standard edition, Life is Strange Reunion is being sold at a price that is, in itself, a selling point. In a market where 10 to 15-hour narrative games shamelessly arrive at $70, Deck 9 and Square Enix made a conscious choice to price Reunion below the AAA standard. This tells me two things. Either they have total confidence in the product and want to lower the barrier to entry, or they recognize that a game without a market-standard current-gen version needed a more accessible price to compete. It's likely a bit of both. Now, the question of buying at launch or waiting depends on who you are in relation to the series. If you are a fan of the first Life is Strange, not just casual, but the kind of person who still thinks about the Arcadia Bay ending when they least expect it, you're going to buy it at launch anyway. And honestly, I think you should. This game was made for you. It was built as a direct response to what these characters meant, and the experience of playing without knowing the endings, without being spoiled, is irrecoverable once the game is out. If you played Double Exposure and felt frustrated, then the math changes. That game was widely criticized for choices that had no real weight, pacing that lost steam in the second half, and a way of handling Max that wasn't convincing. Reunion seems to be responding directly to those critiques, with more care and facial expressions, the chemistry between the characters, and a choice system with more significant ramifications. But looking like it will be better in previews isn't a guarantee. If you were burned by Double Exposure, waiting 2 weeks after launch to see full reviews is the smartest decision. 2 years of anticipation can handle 15 more days. The game is recommended for anyone who values emotional narrative, choices with moral weight, and characters that feel like real people, rather than video game archetypes. It's not an action game, it's not a game of difficult puzzles, and there's no combat. It is essentially an interactive television series, where the script has 11 years of emotional build-up behind it. If you like Disco Elysium, Oxenfree, or Celeste on the emotional side, you will understand the language of this game. If you need active gameplay all the time to stay engaged, it's probably not for you. I think I'll buy it at launch because paying $40 for a game that promises to be the emotional closure of a story I've followed for over a decade is mathematically an acceptable risk. I've spent more on games that delivered much less. The low price combined with the fact that the game arrives complete, no episodes, no Season 2 promised, is a rarity in the current market that I respect. The only situation where I'd say wait before buying is if you haven't played the first Life is Strange yet. It would be like jumping into the last episode of a TV series without having seen anything before. Technically possible, but you'll miss exactly what makes this ending have weight. Fortunately, the original game is available on multiple platforms for a very low price, and Life is Strange Remastered is a decent entry point. Invest there first. Let Max and Arcadia Bay break you the right way, and then Reunion will work as it should. What convinces me more than any technical or price argument, though, is what those who played the previews described about the dynamics between Hannah Tell and Rihanna DeVries in the reunion scenes between Max and Chloe. One preview literally said the chemistry between the two is incredible, and that Chloe's performance in a specific look right after their reunion is the kind of detail that only appears when everyone on set believes in what they are doing. And to me, that is worth more than any frame rate benchmark or Metacritic score. When the actors believe in the story, you believe in it too. And when you believe, $40 vanishes from your memory the moment you hit the buy button.
Monster out of my head, under my bed, thinking something out of my nightmares. See me right there. But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, then will you get bored of killing me? Then will you get bored of killing me? Then will you get bored of killing me?